Yet again, Japan is having a new prime minister as 64-year-old Sanae Takaichi takes office formally on the 15th of October after becoming the leader of the largest of Japan's parliamentary parties. She is seen here in her days as a news reporter talking about the launch of the Super Nintendo system. In this quick video, we're just going to look at the changing context in Japan and then deep dive how one particular policy position expressed in a 2021 policy paper may be a particularly big deal for Nintendo. It's only a year since I talked about Shigeru Ishiba becoming the Japanese Prime Minister, but having a new Prime Minister so soon after Ishiba took office isn't actually all that unusual for a country whose premiers frequently only last a year, despite the vast majority of the Prime Ministers being from the same ruling Liberal Democratic Party. Still, Takaichi will make headlines both as the first female Prime Minister of Japan and for a series of policy positions that are distinct from some of her immediate predecessors, including resistance to increasing Japan's rate of immigration and interest in big spending and fiscal stimulus. While the specific soap opera of the top of Japanese politics won't usually affect Nintendo directly, the company's choices aren't insulated from political directives either. We saw in the last year or so the company elect more female board members in compliance with regulations mandating that 25% of the boards of large companies should be women. In an international context, some price increases seem to directly follow changes in US-Japanese tariff arrangements over the last year. Probably, in the short to medium term, there won't be any major changes for Nintendo. Takaichi has already confirmed that she will honor the tariff arrangements with the US negotiated by her predecessor. Also, from a pragmatic perspective, she finds herself leading a party without a majority in either of the country's chambers, limiting her ability to act without not just internal discussion within her party, but some degree of cooperation between parties, including her current coalition partners with whom she has some significant disagreements. In this sense, she may not be significantly longer lived in the post than her immediate successor, Ishiba. However, if she can push through with some of her policy positions, this may impact Nintendo. The major impact of fiscal stimulus would probably be to weaken the yen by generating a degree of inflation. While this may have issues in the long term, the short-term outcome for Nintendo is likely to be positive, with more customers in Japan able to leap on their more expensive new system, and a weaker yen meaning that their console sales abroad will become more valuable. Of course, at a time when many countries are using fiscal stimulus to try to inflate away COVID debts and rescue flagging economies, the yen stands to strengthen against other currencies just by standing still. Until recently, a slightly stronger yen has actually been an objective of the Bank of Japan, especially because Japan imports a huge amount of its food and fuel, which has knock-on effects for the cost of living. Then again, it's not quite as simple for Takaichi as it may seem to change Japan's fiscal approach. The Bank of Japan is independent of the government, and an official has indicated that they may continue with the fiscal tightening plan irrespective of the person in the role of Prime Minister. Keeping with fiscal tightening would also avoid a confrontation with the US, where a likely US presidential visit could sour quickly if Japan was seen to undermine the efforts to weaken the US dollar relative to other currencies, which is part of the US plan to make American exports more internationally competitive. Despite all this, though, there is one specific policy position Takaichi has which might affect Nintendo specifically in a very big way. She generally takes a low tax position and is keen to avoid any further tax hikes, which will obviously be welcome to Nintendo in general. Her suggested corporate tax breaks for childcare offerings may square with Nintendo's already reportedly quite supportive policies to help its staff members who are also parents, and so tax reductions would be clearly welcomed by Nintendo. However, in 2021, she argued that a tax on corporate deposits could raise 2 trillion yen per year, or 1 trillion if smaller businesses were exempted. In other words, this would involve taxing corporate savings. For many Western companies and a good number of Japanese ones, this wouldn't make too much impact, but Nintendo always has a huge amount of cash in reserve, including money held in various securities and investments. Having this kind of cash on hand is useful for the company in various ways. To quote the 2025 annual report, Nintendo maintained retained earnings that are necessary in order to adapt to changes in the business environment and to pursue further business expansion, etc., in the future. Major components of the working capital requirements include purchase expenses of materials and parts for manufacturing, advertising expenses, and research and development expenses, and dividend and income tax payments. Moreover, it is Nintendo's basic policy to internally provide the capital necessary to fund future growth, including capital investments. End quote. Essentially, having this cash on hand means the company can make decisive moves at a short notice, especially useful when dealing with global supply chains in a fast-moving world where one small issue can create huge consequences. Even for smaller companies in the video game space, it can be useful to keep this kind of cash on hand for unexpected issues. As games become more costly and complicated to make and test, that flexibility may be the difference between many of the smaller companies in Nintendo's orbit that have gone under over recent years, like Skip, Vanpool, and Alpha Dream, and those which have continued to stay in business, like Camelot and Goodfeel. It is also used for bonuses and, of course, for shareholder dividends. Let's put this into hard numbers. Nintendo said that as of April 2025, they had 461% of their liabilities covered by their assets, i.e., for every $1 that was a liability, they could put against it $4.61, and $2.10 of that would be in highly liquid forms, cash or cash equivalents. Roughly speaking, in 2025, Nintendo had 1.6 trillion yen, or 10 billion US dollars, in cash. A 1% raid on this would be equivalent to $100 million every year, although it could be less, as Takaichi noted in her policy paper that she would want to ensure that there is no overlap with corporation tax so the company isn't taxed on the same money twice. $100 million a year is relatively small in the context of Nintendo's $4.5 billion annual profit as of 2024, around 2% maybe, but of course that was off a particularly strong year. If their profits were to halve next year due to increased manufacturing costs and a smaller install base for their games, it may be more like a 4 to 5% impact, and of course, Nintendo hasn't always turned a profit at all over recent years. It will depend on how any potential legislation is worded as well. This graph speaks to the huge cost invested in getting the new system off the ground, with the year ending March 2024 showing a vast loss from investing activities and a huge boon by March 2025 as Nintendo cashed in its investments to fund, one would assume, the huge logistical and manufacturing challenge of getting a new system off the ground. Quite how the tax might be structured to support or penalise these ventures is something that I'm sure would need to be thrashed out in the Japanese parliament. The fact is that having a large amount of cash in reserve becomes even more important at times when a company's cash flow is weak. Recall that in the Wii U era, Satoru Iwata cut his own salary to guard against job losses while reassuring staff that Nintendo had reserves to see them through long periods on the outs if need be. All taxation choices have winners and losers and require trade-offs and benefits, but Nintendo might find that this particular choice, if enacted, would hit them particularly hard compared to other major Japanese corporations given their fiscally cautious corporate culture and the volatile nature of their business. They may feel comfortable given the relative success of their system, passing on the tax effectively to consumers through prices, or they may be able to move some of this money overseas to other subsidiaries, depending on the wording of the tax. At this point, it remains a policy idea in a 4-year-old paper rather than an active plan for government, and Takaichi's fragile position may mean that the idea will go no further in any event. Still, I would anticipate that Shuntaro Furukawa and the board will watch with caution any further developments from the new Japanese leadership. Thank you so much for watching as ever. Do check out the Patreon for more, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.